I'll now go to what is section 9 in your notes, in the explanatory notes, called Practices to Reduce Your Emissions. So if we just recap where we've come from, we've got to the point so far of just thinking about emissions, the environment, I suppose, we're trying to operate in, and understanding those emissions. I now want to talk a little bit about what opportunities there are to reduce those emissions, because I reckon for most of the clients I've worked with, once they get over that initial rush of, oh, I've got to do a carbon project, to realising maybe doing a carbon project isn't the starting point. The starting point's understanding your emissions, and then the next obvious question is there anything that I could do to reduce those emissions that makes sense? And by make sense, I mean is profitable and isn't having an impact on the productivity of the business. So there's a lot we can talk about in this space, and there's a lot of work that we can do in this space. I should say that because the supply chain has been talking quite a bit about emissions intensity and lowering emissions intensity, there becomes a bit of a contradiction between showing a lower emissions intensity number that doesn't necessarily correlate with having lower emissions. You could actually maintain or increase your overall farm emissions, but if you're far more productive, you will lower your emissions intensity. So we just need to be aware of that, well, contradiction, I suppose, between the two, particularly as the supply chain is asking more and more around emissions intensity numbers. That does not necessarily equate to lowering overall farm emissions. A couple of other important things that I'll talk about, and there is a lot of talk about emission lowering practices. And I'd alluded to this, that they can't always be recognised in the current emission calculators. So I'll talk about a number of things, but you could say, oh, I'm now doing this, but it's very hard to show that in a credible way in the calculators. So if people are using the numbers from the calculators as evidence, some of these practices you might be doing would have to be taken on good faith rather than necessarily accepted standards of reduction. And a good example of this is some of the feed additives that are being used. There are lots of studies being undertaken on those at the moment, but they have varying results. They're not always showing the same exact reduction in emissions, for argument's sake. So which value do you use? And so that's where that scientific rigour and that peer-agreed numbers need to come from before they get included in the calculators. So just recognise when people start talking about, oh, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, to be wary that having those recognised in the calculators is difficult. And the second one is just to recognise that some of these practices that we can do will cost. So implementing them, while they're good, they can be associated with time, money and effort. Ideally, you'd like to think this will be rewarded through the supply chain by a premium or higher price. More often than not, I think it's just going to be around access. If you meet this certain criteria, then we will buy from you. If not, we won't. So we also need to be aware that some of these practices, I could go and do that, but how do I get recognition for it? And that's actually going to cost me money to do. How can I recoup that money? So we don't lose this profitability, productivity, the importance of that in our farm business in chasing lower emissions or emissions intensity. I'm going to jump in and do the livestock one first. Now, this is a very busy first slide, but I've done this because I tried to order the way I think about what are all the practices that are out there that potentially could lower emissions in a business. And I've split it up into, so this is at the property level, and this is about either reducing your emissions or emissions intensity, noting that those two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And I've split it up to what can we do to manipulate at the farm level. So that's about the whole farm business. And then on the other side, the two over here is what can we do to manipulate the individual animal in that farming business. So same number of animals, don't do anything about changing the way the business operates, but change how each individual animal performs. And if we start to think about livestock, about 85% of most livestock businesses, it's associated with methane as our emissions. Then we've got to be thinking about how we can actually change the overall output of methane in particular as part of that. So this is the way I've put this together. I'll show you at the end. There's a Word doc I've put in there, and I've called it Figure 1 and 2. Just to allow you, if you wanted to rearrange this slide and put some of these in different order for the way you wanted to speak, it's there as a Word document, which makes it easier for you to modify it if you want to modify it or put colours on it or whatever else. The other thing I've done in this is put some asterisks around some of the emission lowering technologies that I feel like are still in development and haven't got to the stage where we've got some reasonable understanding of the quantum of what the benefits might be as part of that. So they're underway, but they're not quite there yet. So if I just follow through, so what I'd like to do is just follow through some of these and just talk a little bit about it. They're in the notes as well. So if you wanted to follow through on the notes, I've just made some little comments under the different headings. So they're in Appendix 1 and 2. So I didn't put them in the main notes, so they're in Appendix 1 and 2. So this livestock stuff starts at page 5 of those. So if we look at the first one around enterprise mix and timing of operations, and you can have a play around with this. If you set up a baseline farm, start playing around with a few of these options and seeing what changes it makes to both emissions and emissions intensity. Obvious one, if you want to reduce your emissions and if you reduce your livestock numbers, that's going to make a difference because you just don't have as many animals pumping out emissions. And you can see why it's a common response that people don't understand farming to say, well, if we had less animals, if we stopped eating beef, then we'd have less emissions. It does have some validity because the numbers do go down as part of that, but people still need to eat and still need to be clothed. So it's not necessarily the most sensible or obvious one to do, but it does make a bit of a difference. And if you play around with that, you can see how numbers can make a difference to that emissions output. Choice of operation is another one that's just worth having a bit of a consideration on. You generally find that if you've got a self-replacing operation, that your emissions will be higher per kilo of beef because you have animals for a long period of time that are there growing out to get to that reproductive phase, as opposed to if you're in a trading operation. So even the way the calculators work at the moment, a trading operation, even though you get pinged for scope 3 of those animals being born somewhere else, they generally show up as having lower emissions than if you're in a breeding and self-replacing type operation. Having said that, the choice of operation and particularly the timing of it when you're lambing and calving also is pretty important. When you're selling animals is also pretty important. And the obvious one here of matching feed supply animal demand so you can grow as many animals as fast as possible is an important sort of consideration in there. And if you can change, if you play around and say if you're in a sheep operation and you can join your maidens and have them lambing earlier than 2-year-olds, it will make a difference when you do your calculations. So just have a bit of a play around with that, putting aside the logistics of actually making that work. And the effort and everything else that goes into it and all the other flow-on effects from that, if you're just playing around with numbers and when things happen, and the timing of that can make a difference. The timing of when you sell animals can make a difference if you're holding them on and they're growing slower over a period of time because you want to get bullocks rather than steers off or whatever it might be. So worth having a bit of a play with that. And I keep emphasising build a base farm that is relevant to your area and your clients and who you're talking to, and then play around, tweak some of these things and see what impact they have. And the last one in the enterprise mix and stuff like that is about removing passengers. I've been really surprised in the clients that I've worked with that they might have ewes that might be dry, but they're not running any wethers, or cows that may have lost a calf or are empty, and they'll hang on to them for 6 or 8 months before they sell them. You'll be surprised there's a 5 or 10% penalty you have in your emissions when those sort of things happen. So getting rid of passengers early is something that can have an immediate and pretty simple impact on the amount of emissions that you produce. So that's in that 1.1 around the enterprise mix and operation. These other ones I'll now go into with a few more slides. So I didn't have any slides on those. I think that's just something you've got to talk through because there's so many variations of that sort of combination of what can go on there. If we go down to 1.2, which is the pasture that's being offered, the first one is that you will find that if you've got high quality pasture and lots of it, your animals will grow faster, or things being equal, which means that your weights and your turn off can be quicker, which will lower your emissions and your emissions intensity, or your animals will grow faster, which will not necessarily lower your emissions, but certainly will have a positive impact on your emissions intensity. So growing lots of high quality feed is a super important one. And it comes down to the basics: right species, right grazing management, right soil fertility conditions, pH, all of that sort of stuff to grow lots of things. Okay, it's all bread and butter stuff that we should know, should have been doing for ages, but I find a lot of farms there's still some scope to fiddle around with that one, which will have a positive impact on emissions intensity in particular. There's a bit around species selection that's going on at the moment. A number of the companies now are breeding to increase a few things called tannins and oils or lipids that are in the plants that you've got. Both tannins and oils will lower emissions coming out of the animals by reported around about that 10 to 20% sort of mark. And I'll show you a few of those in a tick. They're also doing quite a bit of work on trying to balance up a bit more the protein to energy ratios in common plants like subclover, lucerne, ryegrass and stuff like that. Main reason being is that when we get this excessive imbalance of protein in the diet to energy, and when the animals are eating that, if they have excess protein, as people know, they've got to piss it out, otherwise it'll poison them through nitrate accumulation. So they urinate that out. In the calculator, if you're feeding them a higher protein diet, you will increase the amount of emissions that come from urine and dung. So in the calculator, that picks it up. So if people are saying, oh, I'll change the quality of the feed because I don't think the feed quality is right, just be mindful that as the protein levels get higher and higher and higher, your emissions will start to go up a bit as well because of the excess nitrogen that the animals are excreting as part of their dietary function. So as they're eating, they'll get rid of that extra stuff. So there is quite a bit of work going on behind the scenes at the moment to try and, if you like, lower the excess protein for the ratio of energy, which will have a positive effect on your emissions calculation. And it's being bred into some of the common plants that we use. So it's not a major change in species shift over the pastures you've got. Obviously, you've got to introduce them, so it's a resowing bit, but that's likely to be turning up in the future. Also, some of the temperate legumes we do know that have these tannins and oils in them, and the tannins in particular. So things like Sulla, arrowleaf clover's got it, Ceredella's got it, Vetch has got it. So all of those, as they're testing them with animals, are resulting in a small reduction in emissions from those animals, the amount of methane that those animals are breathing out, in the order of 10 to 15%, a lot of the trials are showing. So I think in the future there's going to be really opportunity for that in the legumes that we've got. And also some of the herbs. So chicory and plantain that people have probably heard about, work being done on that as well, showing similar sort of reductions. So if we're thinking about what can you do to reduce your emissions, I think over time there will be a change in the species mix that we use and the the selection of that and the balance of that across a farm. Notwithstanding that it's still got to fit the farm system and your growing season and all those sort of things. But there's a bit of hope, I reckon, in the species that we've got. And these aren't too far off the mark. In fact, chicory and plantain is out there now. The measurements are being done now. People are using them now. They just can't be recognised at the moment in the calculators. So you could say, I'm going to put 20% of my farm down to chicory and plantain because that'll reduce my emissions. You won't get recognised in the official calculators for that at the moment. But that could change relatively quickly if there's a big enough body of evidence and people move fast enough to include it. Just how that will be recorded, I don't really know. I don't know what evidence you need. Is one chicory plant a square metre enough, or do you need 20 of them? All of those things have got to sort of be sorted out. But just keep in the back of your mind that the species stuff, I think, will play an important part of where we go in the future. The second one, so that was the plant side of it. So that's manipulating the farm, and that's that feed base we're manipulating. If we go across to the individual animals and we start to think about what are our opportunities, there is quite a bit of work being done around genetics at the moment. I've flashed this graph up before, and people probably didn't take too much note of it, but in the beef side of it, the calculation of methane is 20.7 times intake. And this is an international standard that they use, and it's based on this line, and it's based on this type of data. Okay, so this is dry matter intake along the bottom. This is the methane produced up here. And so the line of best fit is where the 20.7 comes. It's the slope of that line. But as you can see here, if we take, say, in the dairy side of it, an animal could eat 20 kilos a day, or around about 20 kilos a day around here, and produces about 300 or just under 300 grams of methane, or could eat the same amount and a different animal has been producing 450 grams of methane. Basically showing there is variability in the methane production from animals eating the same feed. And so the opportunity then to select for these that are lower methane producing is quite exciting. There's a big project at the moment. I'll put the link in your notes there to stuff that MLA are doing, which is the low methane breeding program they've got going. They're tipping a heap of dough into that to try and identify these animals. We're not far away from having ASBVs and EBVs for this, built off the back largely of net feed intake and feed conversion efficiency traits, but they're doing a bit more work on that as well. So I think relatively soon, in fact, you can get some breeding catalogues now or sale catalogues now where they are actually advertising that these are low emission animals. Biggest problem is they have bugger all accuracy with them because we don't have a big enough data set on them at the moment. And if anybody knows their genetics, if you don't have accuracy, you've got to be really wary of reading too much into what the value is, because we just don't have a big enough data set to know the repeatability on it. But it's evolving. Okay, the science would be suggesting that couple of things. One is it's got low heritability, which is a bit of a bugger, which means how much of it carries through to the next generation is pretty low. But the change is permanent. And they're looking at around about 1% per generation is the improvement that you're making. So, and it's a cumulative permanent one. So if you did that for 10 years, you could be looking at potentially a 10, 15% reduction in the methane that's coming out of your animals as part of that. Genomics will also help for anybody that's familiar with the genomic side of it. As they build up the database with that, we'll be able to select for animals that are lower emissions as part of that. Again, can't be recognised in the calculator at the moment. Every animal, irrespective of what it is 20.7 times what it eats. And we know both of those are variable, but that's what we're stuck with at the moment. So that's the genetic side of it. The reproductive side, I reckon this is pretty obvious to most people. The more productive they are and the more of them you have, the better off you are. You know, if you've kept that ewe and she's been producing emissions and you can turn off 2 lambs instead of 1 lamb as a result, while your total emissions may go up a bit, the quantity that you're turning off would be much higher, so your emissions intensity will go down. So the obvious things, how do you maximise productivity out of those breeding animals is a critical one. So all the obvious things of condition score, scanning, or health, all of that, RAM, RAM condition, all of that sort of stuff, all the things we know, okay, can make a difference. And I reckon on most farms, unless they've been really active in this space, there is some potential room for improvement. And we've certainly found that at home. We were concentrating on our livestock, on our sheep stuff as much as we have in the last 5 years. We've ramped that up from the merinos, and we've got now about another 35% lambs on the ground in 5 years because we've paid more attention to getting all of the fine details in this right, which is making a difference to our emissions intensity, not our emissions per se, but our emissions intensity is certainly getting lower as a result of it. So reproductive performance is another area that you can start to think about and talk about. Animal health, pretty obvious one. If they die or they're not growing as fast as they could because of subclinical problems, whether it's worms or whatever else it might be, that's going to cost you because they've emitted to a time before they die. Or if they're not growing as fast, they're going to cost you as well. Diet supplementation is one that's been talked around quite a bit. I've already referred to the oils and the tannins in feedstuffs, but you can also buy these commercially now and use them. So Agatane, I think it's called, Neutral's another one, but there are products that you can actually buy and put into feeds and put into water to actually use that have reportedly these sort of reductions in emissions as a result of it. Can't be recognised in the calculators at the moment, but they're certainly about. Or if you stick them together, people have probably heard of Grape Mark, which have both tannins and oils in them. And Grape Mark, in the early days, was giving the story there was about a 20% reduction in emissions if they ate that as part of the diet on a regular basis. So that's something you can use. The other one is to modify the rumen itself, and there's been a lot of talk around this, particularly around some of the what I'll call the methane inhibitors, to bundle them all together. And they're things like the Asparagopsis or the seaweed. So an algal-based sort of product, which reduces the amount of methane that the animal produces or loses through regurgitation. I reckon despite all the hype around it, I reckon the algal stuff's still got a fair way to go. It has got a few negative or downsides with it. It does produce a chemical called bromoform, and it breaks down. Bromoform destroys ozone, so it's got a negative effect there. It's also been registered in too much bromoform as a carcinogenic substance. So there's a few other things still to work out from that algal side of it and trying to get that right. So that's one of them. What else have we got in here? Yeah, there's one that you can buy at the moment, which is 3-nitrooxypropionate, or called Bovaer. It's a commercial product. It's now registered in Australia, used quite a bit overseas, and works reasonably well, or works well when you've got a set mixed ration that you can feed animals. So it's one that's being adopted quite actively in feedlots now, because you can put that in the feed and they can get a regular and ongoing dose of it, and they're looking at about a 30% reduction in emissions. Just to highlight this one, there are some papers that say you get a 90% reduction in it. Some papers say that you get a 5 to 10% reduction in it. Richard's suggesting to me that probably overall it'll be about 30% is what the crediting will be for using something like that. But it's available on the market at the moment. And I do know some feedlots that are starting to use it and doing trials on it. Only downside with this and the other one is they seem to need to be on feed for a little bit longer to get the target weight. So there may be a slight suppression in overall growth as part of it as well. and it's got a cost associated to it, obviously, in doing it. Works pretty well in the sort of mixed ration, regular feeding type thing. The challenge, obviously, in broadacre is how do you get these animals to eat this on regular doses at regular times, which is then there's a lot of work being done on just different delivery mechanisms as far as whether it's a bolus or something like that you inject and you get so many days out of it of regular release or constant release of the product to be able to do it. There was one exciting bit of work done with 3-Nop a couple of years ago, where young weaner cattle, when they were weaned off mum and they were yard fed for 2 weeks with a ration that had 3-Nop in it, and then they retested them again 14 months later or something, and there was about a 20 to 30% difference in their methane production 12 months later. So in other words, there'd been a modification to the rumen, which had actually remained permanently in those animals, at least up to that sort of 12, 14-month period. And there was a significant difference between that and the animals that hadn't been treated when they'd just gone out and grazed exactly the same for 12 months after that. So there may be some way that we can modify the rumen in a young animal that will then last for a longer period of time and actually change the long-term function of the rumen as far as methane loss goes. So that's an area that's got a bit of excitement in it as well. And I've written a bit of stuff on that. There are a couple of other ones. If I just flick back to this graph here, sorry, I should have put this at the start. So they were the dietary sort of supplements, 2.4 down there. There's a bit of work going on with vaccines at the moment. Most advanced is one company that, and the beauty of the vaccines is that it modifies, you vaccinate the animal, it modifies the saliva compounds that are coming out of the saliva, one of which is a compound that reduces the methane loss or methane production in the rumen. Beauty about that is because they're salivating all the time, they're getting this constant dose all the time. So there may be something in the vaccines. They're probably a decade away, Richard reckons, before they're going to be at any commercial sort of level that we can use. But they're certainly on the horizon, and I think long term, particularly if you start looking at bigger properties that don't get cattle in very often, being able to vaccinate may be the most sensible opportunity out of everything that we've got here. And the last one is methane destroying technology. This exists at the moment. It's the UK company. It's called ZELP, so Zero Emissions Livestock. I should have put a photo in for you, but it's basically like a harness that goes on the head of the animal, and as the methane is breathed out, it captures it and turns that into benign gases. So it basically burns up the methane as the animals breathe it out. Obviously works better in things like dairy situations than it would in broadacre grazing. But that's another bit of technology that's sort of about in a niche market at the moment. Not sure how it'd go with 5,000 ewes running around in a paddock or with these little harness things on their heads catching the methane they're breathing out. But that technology's there as well. One, just look at this that I failed to mention when I talked about the genetics was around the mature female weight. And I haven't got an asterisk on this, but it's just worth noting both for sheep and cattle that as your standard reference weight of your breeders go up, your females go up, if you can cast your mind back to a graph that I had about weight of animals and how that affects the emissions calculation, the heavier your mature female weight, the higher you'll get pinged for her emissions. And if you look at the evidence over the last 15, 20 years through both breed plan and when you look at the sheep side of it as well, there's been an increase, say for the Angus herd, I think we're up to about plus 103 kilos or something for our live weight in cows at the moment. In other words, over a 20-odd year period, the cows have got over 100 kilos heavier as the average mature cow weight of the females. In the calculator, that's actually giving you a significant increase in emissions because it calculates on the basis that they will need to eat more for their maintenance. So just when you're talking to clients, the opportunity of just exploring the female weight, we've chased that because female weight's been associated with growth from a genetic point of view. So people chasing growth have ended up getting heavier mature cows. As part of that, there's more in maintenance and stuff like that, and reproductive issues as well of getting them right conditions so they ovulate again. But you're also getting pinged for it in your emissions calculation. And so the possible pressure to put selection and have lower mature cow weights over a long period of time working towards that while maintaining your growth is possible, and might be worth looking into. Our mature cow weight's about 35 kilos below breed average, even though our growth rate of our steers is in the top 10% in breed average. So you can select the difference between the two. That 30 kilo difference is worth about 5% to us compared to if I put in mature, the standard reference weight compared to the weight that we actually know that our mature females are in a certain condition score. So just another one that's worth having a little bit of a think about. Before I jump into the cropping, Em, just might ask, has anybody got any questions around some of this stuff? Because I dumped a fair bit on you.
Hi, Cam, Meg here. Just a question about the impact or the long-term impact of some of this rumen modification. Like, it kind of goes a little bit at odds with like clean green production a little bit, doesn't it, in terms of, feeding pasture, wild, free grazing animals, and then we're going to go and feed them these things that are going to modify the way their bodies work, in theory, and, that maybe have impacts down the line that we're not really aware of as yet.
Yeah, really good points. And there are some animal health issues that are being recognised in feeding some of this stuff. They tend to be kept quiet. We only hear the positive or the good news about some of these methane inhibitors and the rumen modification stuff, but there are also some downsides that they're certainly finding with it. I don't have an answer as to which way we should go with this, but I think it's certainly worth understanding that they're going to have pros and cons associated with them, I suppose is the best way of looking at it. And it's going to be up to individual businesses that will determine that based on what markets are looking for. I think that's the way it'll separate out. There'll be some markets that just need protein and are happy to accept this. There'll be other markets that won't because they want the clean green stuff. We as advisors need to be aware that there are downsides as well as the positives, and it's much harder to find the downsides because everybody downplays them and talks up the good sides of it. As I said, there's stuff that I learned from the feedlotters because that's one of the feedlots we supply, and in private conversations, that's what they were saying. This is what we're finding. It's not all beer and Skittles. So there's a fair way to go with this. I'm not overly concerned at the moment because I don't think this would be something I would have high up on my list if I was talking to a client of this is what we need to do. I reckon if you go through that tree that I had up there, there are lots of other things that potentially we can investigate and I think find some opportunities to improve before we need to go down this path anyway. But it's a fair point. There will be some markets that certainly won't want this.
Thanks, Cam.
Yeah, Cam, it's Josh Holiday, just following on from Meg's query. I just looked up CH4 Global, which are a company that have started up on the Lower Eyre Peninsula producing this seaweed. And just looked into some of their studies, and one of them actually has both metrics used, so GWP 100 as well as GWP star. Now, I haven't read much past that, but that just made me think, I just wonder whether they're just using the metric to suit themselves. And I just thought I'd highlight that and see if we'd come across that at all.
I haven't come across the company directly, but I'm not surprised that you see that sort of thing. Go back to what I described of the only way you can count the impact of GWP 100, GWP star today is to know what your emissions were 20 years ago, your methane emissions were 20 years ago, because that's the way the calculation works. You need to know your emissions 20 years ago and your emissions today. I don't know how they would apply it to a study like that. I'd be really interested to see how they go about it. But you will find this all the time. You will find people selectively picking bits of information out as part of this, and they will claim their study's got a 90% reduction. You go and find a study somewhere else using the product and it's a 10% reduction. And then as advisors, we need to look at the bulk or I think recognise what's the best science telling us. So when you pull it all together, and I think someone asked yesterday who is doing this. We've been a bit slow off that. Richard Eckhardt has actually been one of the people through Melbourne Uni trying to drive this. I think it'll get a lot more horsepower with this new CRC, this net zero CRC, because they've bought like 90% of Richard's time. So I think there will be a number of really good operators that will now start trying to advance the assessment of this and the inclusion of this in calculators. So that will be a welcome thing, because we've been very slow on trying to incorporate some of these things into it at the farm level. But just be wary. You'll get individual companies all over the place making claims of different studies and so on.
Another one, Cam?
Yep.
Cole here, Cam. I'm just thinking a lot of this material, especially in the livestock side, is very prospective. For example, grape mark, we know that can reduce methane output, but it also inhibits production. So, certainly I think the algal studies so far are fairly, shall we say, prospective. So you'd be hard pressed to recommend to producers to start looking at some of these technologies when it's all very, I guess, experimental. And even with the using the like chicory and plantain, that's fine for people in higher rainfall areas. But if we're talking, the 400 mil type rainfall, we've got, I guess, vetch and Ceradella, but the opportunities are pretty limited in those sort of areas.
Yep, absolutely. The reason why I put these up was not necessarily to sell them, but to make you aware of they're about. People will talk about them, and exactly your comments. You need to work out what's likely to fit in our environment, and the speculative nature, or the positive press around some of this is actually hiding some of the downsides. And you as an individual just need to be able to balance that up and find what might work and what doesn't work. And it's sort of the reason why I put this together. Now, I'm really comfortable if people want to rearrange this or add other things into it, but I've tended to find when I can put something like this up when we're talking about this side of things, and you may even want to say, look, these are a bit speculative. These are ones that we can do now and look at now. I'm an agronomist by background, and I think the opportunity of getting better quality pastures of what we've already got and making animals grow faster, most farms there's opportunity for that. And that's a good place to start. It's a comfortable place for most people to start. So I'm focused a lot on this. I've got a watching eye on this. I'm certainly on this one, mature female weight, and just having a conversation around that. Reproductive performance, we can tick off on. Animal health, we can tick off on. Parking this one for a bit at the moment, because that's where everybody thinks is the silver bullet, but it's really not. And I just need to know about those things. So I think there's more than enough in here for us to at least start a conversation. What can we do of lowering emissions without necessarily having to go into some of the magic potions and stuff like that we don't know much about.
I'm curious, amongst all the livestock consultants in the room, on that left side column, Cam, that you had up, sorry, is there anything on there that you're not already recommending that correlates with production anyway? Yeah, just saying, Cam, it's another motivation, having these things.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And could I just say it's once you've done your baseline calculation, the biggest power I've found is you start doing a couple of what ifs. So if you can look at that and go, gee, you know, they're producing, they're in a 600 mil rainfall zone or something, and they're producing 280 kilos of live weight turning off cattle wise. Yeah, and the benchmark for that should be around about that 380, 400 sort of mark. And you delve into it and you look at how fast they're growing and you look at when we're turning them off and we're looking at how many we get pregnant. The tool allows you to almost sort of re-ask those questions and say, what if we could get more of this? And you can just change a number or two. You get a different emissions intensity number out at the end. And it's sort of a motivation again for people to revisit. But it's much easier to do if you've got a baseline number with them. So if they've got their baseline number, it makes it real for them when you start changing these numbers. But I agree entirely. It's another motivation. And it works really well, actually. If they're interested in this and they're interested in what can I do about it, this is a real good foot in the door. All right, people are happy. I'll move on and do the cropping one as well before we have a break. Let me get to that.
Yep, I think we're good to go.
Yeah. So the cropping ones, I was going to say a bit more straightforward because there are less options at the moment that are sitting there. I've broken this up exactly the same way. I've said, what can you do about manipulating the farm and what can you do about manipulating the crop? So it's the same sort of thing as I did with the animals, manipulating the farm and the feed base and the system. And so manipulating the farm, you've got obviously your crop rotations and how you use that, how we manage our stubbles, a little bit on fuel, a little bit of liming. I've only put those up because they're sort of the bigger ticket items, along with nitrogen use in manipulating the crop. So I should have said the ones I put up for the livestock as well, I didn't include everything in it. You'll notice I didn't bother about things like fuel and stuff in the livestock side of it because you know, it's tiny when you do your calculation. So there's less, I think, opportunity in the cropping one. So for some of the cropping guys, particularly if you're in lower rainfall stuff and sequestrations, you know, more difficult as well as part of that. There is some limitations, some serious limitations at the moment of just what you can potentially achieve. But we'll run through some of those anyway. I should say the easiest way I've sort of done this is the example I gave you yesterday. So the Word document and the GAF tool that had the cropping exercise in it. The Word document, I've run through 3 or 4 different scenarios of manipulating each of these. So one of them that I looked at manipulating was around the crop rotation. So this is a couple of those sort of tools that we can work with as well. But if we start looking at things like crop rotation, there's one example I've put in there. I haven't got slides on it, I've just realised. But all I did was double the area of pulse. If you can vaguely remember, I had 100 hectares of pulse in there in that 1,000 hectare farm. If I doubled the area of pulse to 200 hectares, reduce the area of barley and canola by 50 hectares each, and assume that 200 kilos of urea on those on the 100 hectares of the next lot of crop that was grown comes from the pulse in the other bit of the rotation of the early rotation in that. So it's a substitution effect of some nitrogen in there. You get a 7% reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. Now there's a lot of assumptions in that about assumed yields and all that sort of stuff. But I think once you get that baseline, as I keep banging on about, is you can start playing around with some of these things and you can start to see the impact of it. But there's no doubt that crop rotation, particularly pulse or legume in the rotation in some way, shape or form, and then enabling that to change the amount of urea that you're using does have an impact. Okay, I don't know what it is for each individual system and what that opportunity is, but if that opportunity does exist, have a play around with it because it will make a difference. The calculator recognises that, so to speak. If we move on to the stubble management, stubble side of it, first of all, and I mentioned these numbers changed in the last little while from version 10.7 to 11.0. But for our stubbles, remember I mentioned that the amount of stubble that's left behind is calculated based on your yield and a harvest index. So you don't have the ability to play around with that. It is just fixed for your crops. And the emissions converted into carbon dioxide equivalents, if you tick the box on did we have leaching occur or not, are those sort of numbers. So if you tick it on, you get pinged those sort of numbers and kilos per tonne as part of that, which is, I wouldn't say significant, but it certainly adds a bit to it if you tick them on or off. So I'm only ticking them on and recommending that people tick them on if we've had a really wet year as far as that stubble and stubble management goes. And exactly the same with burning. Burning does have a significant effect. So, and I think I highlighted that yesterday. If you just tick on what fraction was burnt and you go from 1 to 0, you will find it makes a difference. I think from memory, it lowered our emissions intensity for wheat from 0.22 to 0.18 or something. That'll be significant in the market, I reckon, when those numbers change by that amount. So I don't know the opportunity there is to not burn. You may not be burning now, so that opportunity doesn't exist anymore. You're going to have to work out what things are available for you. I'm just sort of highlighting what's around at the moment and what potentially you can use. But, you know, each of them are, that first one around the changing just that bit of a rotation was 6 or 7%. Stubble burning, in the example I gave you before, it's another 7% or something. So they sort of add up over time. You get 2 or 3 of those, and the cumulative effect of them actually makes a difference. I want to spend a little bit of time on the urea fertilizer stuff. I did also put one in there on fuel. If I scroll back just a couple, I did also have fuel use in there, and I've put an example in there in the Word doc of if we reduced our fuel across all commodities by 25%, you only got a 2% reduction in overall emissions in that example. So I focus less on fuel. It seems an obvious one, and you suspect it should be bigger, but the way the calculator works it out, it's not all that big unless you're using large quantities of it, and you can reduce those large quantities by a lot. So fuel efficiency, while obviously we need to strive for it, it's not going to be the change that I'm not going to burn this stubble, or I'll avoid burning that stubble as much as I possibly can unless it's absolutely essential rather than habit. You know, that will make more of a difference than that one will. I'd mentioned the liming yesterday as well, so I don't need to go through that. Only thing I'd say is that with the liming, because it assumes it all happens in 1 year, whichever crop you associate that with, that's where you get pinged for it. I spoke to Rich about this and saying, but we know if you're putting on at least reasonable amounts of lime, that reaction is occurring for more than 1 year. And he said the only way you can get around that is to apportion that and say, you know, 70% of it occurred in the first year, and then you've got to remember that the other 30% occurred in the next year. I don't think that's a viable way of doing it because everybody will forget. So I think at the moment, we're just living with this problem of if you put big dollops of lime on, you get pinged for it in a year, and in the crop you associate that with. And that'll make a difference. So your emissions intensity will be much, much higher, even though all the other crops will benefit from that further on in the rotation, theoretically. Okay, so that's manipulating the farm bit. If we go down to the manipulating the crop bit, as I said, I want to spend a little bit of time on urea and urea fertilizer. This probably isn't new to you, but it's worth, I think, just understanding the manufacture of urea and why you get pinged so much for it. And if you can remember a slide I had up yesterday, the majority of the emissions you get pinged for urea fertilizer is in scope 3. So it's coming from the manufacture of the fertilizer, not your use of the fertilizer on the farm. Okay, so there is a limit to how much we can, even with these nitrogen inhibitors and all that sort of stuff, how much we can actually change what's going on. because a lot of it's to do with the manufacture side of it, and it's why there's so much interest in it. So I'll just run through this quickly with you. You may not ever want to use this with a client, but it's worth, I think, just understanding it. So we make urea from a combination of hydrogen and nitrogen. So we get nitrogen from the air, N2, 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So that's where we get that from. And we combine that with hydrogen. And that hydrogen at the moment is coming from methane, which is one of the reasons why we get ping for it, because we're using methane as part of it. It also requires heat, about 500 degrees Celsius, and high pressure to combine those together. So lots of energy being used down here, as well as the products we use. That creates ammonia, NH3. Now, ammonia theoretically is a greenhouse gas, and it is, but ammonia only stays in the atmosphere for a couple of days at maximum. So you lose ammonia, it reacts and disappears very quickly. So while it theoretically is a greenhouse gas, because it's got four atoms in the molecule, it disappears very quickly. So we tend not to count that as a greenhouse gas. We combine that with carbon dioxide, and the combination of those two with heat again ends up producing urea as a product. And so there's good reason why there's a lot of talk around green ammonia. So if we can make ammonia not using this process, but using it, creating it through other processes that are green, then the amount of emissions that we actually get pinged for going through there would be much, much less, because we're using a different product. And also you can understand why there's all this talk about green hydrogen, because instead of having to use methane, we can get hydrogen from other sources as well, which means it would reduce it down. You may not recall, but yesterday when I was putting up what the different commodity bodies were saying, one of the targets that the grain industry had was, I think it was a 60% or something reduction in Scope 3 emissions for urea. So what they're trying to do, because this is such a significant component of the emissions we're getting pinged with in the cropping game, is to try and make that production much cheaper, sorry, much lower from an emission point of view. So not actually working on farm, working pre-farm gate to try and do this. And there are some investments underway at the moment, and the guys in South Australia are probably familiar with the one on the Eyre Peninsula that's being talked about. There's a number of those going at the moment, and there's potentially a big federal government investment through what's called ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, to invest in some of this stuff as well. And Twiggy Forrest has been involved in it. There's been a bit of stuff in the paper in the last few weeks of how some of these concepts have fallen over, but there's still some interest in trying to create this so that this side of the game has far less emissions associated with it before it gets to an actual product for you. And just to highlight how something like nitrogen in particular, because this is when we've been fiddling around with the clients with Malt Europe, how our manipulation of nitrogen use in the barley that we've been selling makes a big difference. I'll put this example up. This is a mocked up example. So this is a barley crop, doesn't matter how many hectares. We've used 100 kilos of MAP at sowing. And I've lost my phosphorus off there. That should be 22 with phosphorus, sorry. We're burning the stubble. We use 30 litres a hectare of diesel, and we use that little bit of chemical as far as quantity goes. So I just ran that through the calculator. But what I did was look at the yield of the crop with different rates of urea fertiliser. Now, this is a made-up line. This is a made-up yield response line. You may have better ones that you can use yourself. I just wanted to show you more the concept than anything else with urea and emissions intensity. So if you ignore the orange line for a tick, this is our grain yield here. So I've said where we put no urea on, we get a 2-tonne crop. Where we put 50 kilos of urea on, it jumps up to a 4.2-tonne crop. Where we put 100 on, we get 5 tonne, 150, we get 5.4 or something, 5.5. And it goes up, and that classic diminishing returns with input. I've made that blue line up, okay, so don't hold me which trial was this or whatever else. I've just made that up for the sake of this exercise. if you look at it from an emissions intensity point of view, so that's how many emissions did we get for the quantity of product we produced. When we put no urea on at all, our emissions intensity was sitting there at about 0.16. If we put 50 kilos on, even though our emissions have gone up because we grew significantly more yield, significantly more crop, our emissions intensity actually went down to about 0.12. Okay, but because of the diminishing nature of that increasing yield for increasing nitrogen applied, our emissions intensity continues to go up as we're chasing more yield and using that nitrogen for more yield. Now, there's obviously economic points where you stop doing that, quality things where you stop doing that, a whole lot of other considerations in that. But the general concept, and we've found this with a lot of our crops, is that our use of urea, it's very hard as we start getting into more of these final top-up ones, if you like, in that cumulative urea that we use over the year, to actually get lower emissions intensity. We can't squeeze enough yield out to compensate for what we're getting pinged for in the extra urea that we're using. And it's a real dilemma that we've got. If supply chain starts chasing this emissions intensity, we can create more yield and therefore, in a sense, potentially make more profit if it is profitable to do, but our emissions intensity looks shit house. And so there's going to be a fair bit of thinking here about how much do we bother chasing emissions intensity as a number when it's not easy to achieve when you're trying to maximise your yields and stuff like that, or optimise your yields as part of that. So I just wanted to flag that one because I think there's a fair bit of discussion that needs to be had around that. Just a little bit on the nitrogen inhibitors. So there's three types, I suppose, that are on the market at the moment and that we can sort of consider to use. One is the nitrification inhibitors, and that stops NH4 going to NO3 to NO and then to N2O, which is where we get our nitrous oxide losses. I've just put a couple of the brands up there. There are a large number of brands on the market. So then the nitrogen inhibitors, the urease inhibitors work a different way. They end up blocking an enzyme that causes ammonia. So agrotane, green urea, there's many more on the market as well under different trade names you may know about. So they work in different processes, but they're trying to do the same thing, which is to reduce the losses of nitrogen as part of that in different forms, whether that's to the atmosphere or leaching and so on. And then we've got the coatings or the polymers. Now, some of the polymers have got a bit of an issue, particularly selling into the EU. Some of the polymers they won't accept if they're not certain types. So I think most people have been concentrated, if they're thinking about this, of the inhibitors and the nitrification or urease inhibitors as part of that. And you guys may have had more experience with that than I certainly have from the cropping side of it. But what I did want to highlight, though, is if we'd swapped in that example that I had before, so this one that I showed you here, if I'd swapped in this example here and the urea that I was using across here wasn't normal urea or your bog standard urea, but it was nitrogen inhibited urea. So as the numbers go up, what does this actually do to your emissions intensity? And that's the way the calculator pumps it out at the moment. So the use of these inhibitors basically flatlines your emissions intensity as you chase higher yield. As I said, this is a mock example of yield, so don't hold me to it that that's exactly the number you're going to get because I made up the blue line. I made up the response curve.
Just got a question on that from Craig.
Yep.
Yes, Cam, we've obviously got an issue because we're not taking into account the increase in soil nitrogen and then the increased emissions associated with that, those increased rates of nitrogen. So is there any view to be modelling the effects of that on soil nitrogen and also in that terms the increase in pulse intensity and what that's going to do with nitrogen emissions and then the subsequent increase in emissions here?
Yes. So is the question... So just to be clear on the question, it's at the moment the calculators don't care what nitrogen you're starting with. Okay, all they care about is the nitrogen that you put on. Okay, so and that's not, and so the nitrogen change and the leaching and all that sort of stuff and the calculation that's associated with that is being picked up by what's being applied, what's in the pool. Okay, it's I think a serious limitation in the crop calculator of the way this all works. As far as changing that, and I hope I'm answering the question, as far as changing that, I don't know what work's going on at the moment to try and improve that side of it. My understanding from Richard is that the Net Zero CRC will be looking into it, but I don't know of anything that's happening at the moment that's improving that assumption. There's work out there, but as far as being included in the calculator, none that I know of. So, yeah, the use of your nitrogen pool and all that sort of stuff is not part of this at the moment. And the main reason why is that if you think about the origins of the calculator, and I've banged on about this a number of times, they just did not have that information at the national and state level to include it, and most countries don't. In fact, I'd suggest all countries don't. So the agreement of the calculation is at that very high level and doesn't include any of that nitrogen pool stuff at all.
G'day, Cam. Yeah, question from me and Josh Pollitt. We're just trying to get our head around, you said that a lot of the emissions that come from urea from the Scope 3 emissions.
Yep.
What sort of percent is from the Scope 3 versus the Scope 1 and 2? We're sort of surprised how big an impact the inhibitor urea has had on the emissions intensity at those high rates, given that most of the emissions come from Scope 3. Can you explain that and just maybe talk through that graph just a little bit more for us to get our heads around it?
Yes, yeah, no, it's a really good question. I'd spent a bit of time playing around with this. The way, and I'm not, convinced. The way it works at the moment is that the Scope 3 emissions, which are a significant portion of it, I would have expected that line to go up, but go up slower because of the extra emissions that we put in. In the calculator, and the way when I checked it with Richard, he said, no, that's the right way to do it. I don't think it's actually picking that up at Scope 3 well enough. So I share your curiosity about why that hasn't gone up higher when Scope 3 should be about 2/3 of the total emissions that we're using. I wouldn't have thought it would have flatlined like that. I'll go and have a look at that again. But the calculator. So the example that I've given you, which is the unofficial one at the moment, picks up that and includes Scope 3. So Scope 3 is still included in it as a quantity of urea that's used. I'm pretty sure it has. I'll just go and double check that now you've asked. But I couldn't see anything I was doing in the calculation that was wrong, but I expected that line to go up faster than what it has here. So the spread there, particularly when using these higher rates, I wouldn't have thought would have been as big, but it is. But just, can I take that one on notice and I'll go through and check it again. I just had a few things underway in the last day or two while I was putting this together, so bear with me.
Thanks, Cam, for getting back to us on that one. Got another question from Colin.
Yeah, Cam, what about using different forms of nitrogen, for example, sulfate of ammonia, where you don't have the volatilization issue? Does that have the same Scope 3 impact? No, you're treated much more generously, and by generously meaning not associated with anywhere near as many emissions as you are with urea. So urea in the calculators is really in the gun. The studies that have been done and the settled, embedded emissions associated with these products has been done. They're all referenced in the calculators. So if you really wanted to go back and find them all, you're all referenced in studies. But I'm surprised that the difference is that great, but it is. So yeah, one way if you want to
say, well, just have a play with it, but you can change the calculator and it makes a big difference if you're using more non-urea based nitrogen. We're coming back to this issue that used to do my head in, which is we're trying to operate this at the farm level, and there are so many things that it's not picking up in a farm situation. And so you can get really frustrated by the way some of the numbers start falling out. It will get better over time. I'm convinced it will get better over time. Don't ask me the time frame of that, because it depends on a whole lot of other people and a whole lot of dedication to get it right. And how fast they want to move is going to determine that. But you're right, Nick. But I think the best thing you can do as an advisor now is just start playing around with some of this. As I said, I'll check the emissions intensity one, because I was surprised with that. But as I said, I had a bit on my head the last couple of days to go back and recheck it. But any of those sort of things, you think, okay, I'll use more sulfate of ammonia. This is the way it would work, but I'll have to put a bit more lime on. Just change those numbers in the calculator and see what output you get. There are just an infinite number of combinations that you could think of what you can do. But it's a great way to learn your way around the calculator, I can tell you.
I have a question for you around the Scope 3 calculations for urea.
Yep.
The CO2 that's in that equation, we're not getting billed for that, are we? Because we're obviously taking that out of the atmosphere.
Sorry, the CO, where am I? This one here, do you mean? No, we're not getting billed for that. No. In fact, that would be a positive, because you're drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if anything, the manufacturers may be getting a credit for it. I don't know. But I doubt whether they would be if you think it through, because it's not a permanent storing of the carbon dioxide that you've extracted. Because you put it in urea, it turns into another product, and then goes back into the atmosphere in different ways, shapes, and forms. But no, you're not getting pinged for that.
Hey, Camille Fraser. Crop residues often show up as the largest contributor as a Scope 1 emission on your cropping calculators.
Yeah.
Where is the research at with that, or any recommendations for how we actually reduce those emissions from crop residue and its management?
Yeah, you're probably referring to the older calculators, Mel. The new ones have made a significant change to that. So just have a play with them with version 11.0, because that has changed.
Yeah, I did see that. Like in 10.7, it went from 20% down to 10%.
Yeah.
So, all right. But then it's still, 10% is still significant.
Yeah.
In terms of your total emissions profile. As
No.
far as I'm aware, I don't know of any research projects that are focused on this, do you?
No, I don't. No, I don't. And it's obviously very coarse in its calculation. But it certainly, the last change, from the research that was done and all the reports that were out there, was that it was being overestimated, particularly in Australia. And GRDC are investing some money in the residue stuff at the moment. They've got some research stuff going on at the moment, and it may change again. It's
Doing sites in SA for that though.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so we're still looking into that.
Other than nitrogen, it seems like the other major lever we can pull for Scope 1 emissions.
Yeah. I reckon as advisors, where we are looking at trying to get as far in front of the game as we can and have the solutions for it now. A lot of the clients, and I haven't worked as much with the cropping ones as I have with the livestock ones, but there's still a lot we can do over the next couple of years in a positive sense to help in this and understand this and collect the data and do stuff that that information will be available to us when we need it, sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's going to come. And there's a lot of other stuff we can be doing in the meantime. Just one other thing, Em, if we can, before we go for a break, is that I've just put this last table up here. It's on page 13. It's called Appendix 3. What I tried to do, I've reached out to a number of the farming systems groups, and I said, have you done any work with any of these either nitrification, ureas or polymer products? over the years, and have you got any work? The only group I got anything back from was Southern Farming Systems. But what I've been trying to do is just set up a simple database saying if this work's ever been done, and all I've done is compare some of the products that we've got here and the application stage and the rate, comparing that against just standard urea. So standard urea was used in the control. So I'd stopped the whole trial. I just pulled out the standard urea compared against these inhibitor products at different times. So it was just to give people a bit of an understanding of what, if there was any yield difference or if there was any particularly protein differences in the crops. Southern Farming Systems is the only one I've got. So if you know of any other groups that may have done work on this and would be happy to have that in the database. So I was really looking to try and build a database of all the Southern trial work that was done. This is as far as I've got. So this is just a bit of an offer. If you know of any other stuff, if you can shoot that through to me, I'll include it in this database and send it around to people.